there's a cost to staying where you are, and most people never stop long enough to figure out what it is. They assume standing still is neutral, that if they're not losing ground, they're at least holding even. But that assumption falls apart the second you look at it honestly. The moment someone stops growing, something starts getting taken from them. Not all at once, and not in any dramatic way, but steadily, quietly, and without a break. It shows up in small ways first. A little less excitement about the work, a little more irritation at ordinary problems, a feeling that the days are starting to look too much alike and that the sameness isn't comforting anymore. It's just familiar. Familiarity is one of the most deceptive things a person can settle into. It feels like stability because nothing seems to be going wrong, but nothing's going right either. The routine keeps going, the obligations get met, the calendar fills up and empties out again, and at the end of it all, you find yourself in roughly the same spot you were in the year before. That's not stability, that's drifting disguised as consistency. Real stability comes from progress, from knowing you're building something, learning something, becoming something. When that's missing, what's left isn't peace, it's stagnation, and stagnation always comes with a bill. The bill isn't always obvious on the surface. Sometimes it shows up as a frustration you can't quite name, a low-level dissatisfaction that follows you through your days without ever fully announcing itself. You chalk it up to circumstances, to how tough things are right now, to how other people are acting. But the real source of that frustration is usually simpler and closer than you think. It comes from knowing, somewhere underneath all the explanations, that more was possible and not enough was done to go after it. That knowing doesn't go away just because you don't say it out loud. It builds up, and over time it becomes a weight that colors everything. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying that weight, and it has nothing to do with how hard you're working. You can be incredibly busy and still feel this kind of tired because the busyness isn't actually moving you forward. You're burning energy without producing the kind of results that make the effort feel worth it. That gap between effort and meaningful outcome is one of the clearest signs that staying in place has started taking something from you. The activity is there, the hours are being spent, but the progress isn't. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know the difference. What makes this especially tricky is that the cost of staying put rarely shows up as one big, obvious event. It doesn't knock on your door one morning and announce it's here to collect. Instead, it works through accumulation. Each day that passes without growth adds a small amount to the total. Each decision to delay, to put off, to do it next week instead of this week, adds to the balance. And because each individual addition seems so tiny, it's easy to brush off. What's one more day after all? The answer is that one more day is exactly that. One more day added to all the other days. And those days add up into months. And those months add up into years. And at some point, you look back and realize the bill has gotten substantial. That moment of looking back is one of the most clarifying experiences you can have. And it doesn't require decades to get there. You can look back over the last year or the last 3 years and ask a straightforward question. What has changed? Not what happened around you, not what the economy did or what other people decided, but what changed because of your own choices and your own effort. If the honest answer is not much, then staying put has been charging you, and the charge has been consistent, whether you noticed it or not. The awareness itself, though, is where the turning starts. Not the dramatic kind of turning, not the kind that involves blowing everything up and starting over, but the simple and honest recognition that the current situation can't keep going on the terms that currently exist. That recognition isn't comfortable, but it's useful. Discomfort that leads to honest evaluation is one of the more valuable things you can experience. Seeing things clearly, even when it's hard, is always better than the comfort of seeing things wrong, because false comfort doesn't lead anywhere except deeper into the same situation. People tend to put off this kind of honest evaluation because they're afraid of what they might find. They sense that looking directly at their results and comparing them to what they'd hoped for might hurt. So they keep their attention on the activity instead of the outcome, on the effort instead of the return on that effort. But avoiding the evaluation doesn't change the results. The outcomes are what they are, whether you look at them or not. The only thing avoidance changes is your ability to do something about it, because you can't fix what you refuse to see. Here's what makes this worth understanding clearly. The very thing people avoid, the honest accounting, is also the thing that makes movement possible. The cost of staying put only gets paid forever when it goes unexamined. The moment you're willing to look at it directly, the cost becomes useful information. It tells you the current approach isn't producing what you need. It tells you the habits, the thinking, the daily decisions that got you here aren't enough for a different result. That's not a discouraging conclusion, that's a clarifying one, because it points directly at what needs to change. Growth doesn't start with ability, it starts with recognition. You can be capable of way more than you're currently producing. But until you recognize that where you are right now is costing you something real, something measurable, something you wouldn't willingly hand over if you saw it clearly, that extra capacity just sits there unused. The talent is there, the time is there, the opportunities are often there, but the recognition that something has to change isn't in place yet. And without that recognition, all the other ingredients just sit idle. The decision to grow, when it finally shows up, is often quieter than people expect. It doesn't always come with big emotion or dramatic resolve. Sometimes it comes as a calm, firm acknowledgement that this isn't working anymore and something different has to happen. It's less like a fire being lit and more like a door being closed. The door on the version of things where staying put was acceptable. Once that door is closed, the conversation about whether to change is over. The only conversation left is how to change, and that's a much more productive one to be having. What you carry with you from that moment forward is a different relationship with your own results. You're no longer just watching what happens and reacting to it. You're actively involved in shaping what happens because you've accepted that shaping it is your job. That shift changes the quality of your effort, the direction of your attention, and the standard you use to evaluate your daily choices. It doesn't require any outside resources. It just requires being willing to say, plainly and without excuses, that the cost of staying where you are is higher than the cost of doing what growth requires. That willingness is what separates the people who eventually change from the people who eventually settle. It's not intelligence that makes the difference. It's not talent, and it's not having the right conditions. It's the willingness to look at the cost clearly, to refuse to keep paying it, and to accept the responsibility of doing something about it. And once that takes hold, it's the beginning of everything worth building. There comes a point in a person's life where the explanations they've been carrying start to lose their punch, not because the explanations are new. In fact, it's usually because they're not new that they stop working. You can only go back to the same reasoning so many times before something inside you starts to push back against it. The story about the economy, the story about the timing, the story about the people who didn't come through the way they were supposed to. These stories might have helped in the beginning. They might have made the gap between what you expected and what actually happened feel more tolerable. But relief that comes from explaining instead of correcting is temporary by nature, and the more you lean on it, the less it does for you. Results don't care about explanations. They don't adjust based on what you intended or how hard the circumstances were or what would have happened if things had gone differently. They just reflect what was done, consistently and without commentary. You can bring the most carefully built reasoning to your results, laying out every factor, accounting for every variable outside your control, and the results will stay exactly what they are. The numbers don't move because you change the story around them. The outcomes don't shift because you found a better explanation. That's one of the more sobering things a person can come to terms with. But coming to terms with it isn't a defeat. It's the start of a more productive relationship with reality. The habit of explaining isn't born from laziness. And it's important to get that before writing it off too quickly. In a lot of cases, it starts as a genuine attempt to make sense of tough outcomes. When something doesn't go the way you worked for it to go, your mind naturally looks for a cause. And when the cause can be pinned on something outside your own choices and habits, there's a kind of temporary comfort in that. That comfort isn't imaginary. It's real, and it serves a purpose in the short term. The problem is that short-term comfort bought through explanation comes at the expense of long-term correction. And the longer the habit continues, the more expensive that trade gets. There's a real difference between understanding why something happened and using that understanding to change what happens next. The first without the second is just a story. You can develop a really sophisticated understanding of why your results have been what they've been. Trace the causes, identify the factors, assign weight to each one, and still produce the exact same results next year if nothing in your approach actually changes. Understanding by itself doesn't fix anything. It only opens the door to fixing things if it's followed by a willingness to act on what you understood. That willingness is the part that explanation alone can't give you. When you start noticing that your explanations aren't providing relief anymore, when the familiar reasoning starts to feel hollow instead of reassuring, that's worth paying attention to. That hollowness isn't a sign of weakness or failure. It's a sign that something in you has outgrown the explanation and is ready for something more honest. Your mind and character have a way of outgrowing the stories that once served them, and when that happens, it should be recognized for what it is, an invitation to move from the territory of justification into the territory of real correction. Real correction starts with a different kind of question. The question behind explanation is always some version of why. Why did this happen? Why didn't it work? Why are things the way they are? That question is natural, but it tends to point your attention backward and outward. It looks for causes in the past and in other people's behavior and in conditions that already exist. The question behind correction is a different animal entirely. It asks what needs to change, and it points your attention forward and inward. It's about the future rather than an accounting of the past, and it puts the responsibility for the answer on the person asking it. That shift from why to what needs to change is bigger than it looks. It reorganizes how you think about everything. When the question is why, you're a detective examining a scene. When the question is what needs to change, you're an architect working on a plan. The detective role is passive in a way because it's responding to what already exists. The architect role is active because it's deciding what will exist. Both have their place, but only one of them builds a different future. And it's the one that's willing to set down the explanation and pick up the responsibility. One of the clearest signs that someone has been living too long in explanation mode is how they respond when things fall short. If the first and most consistent reaction is to figure out what went wrong outside of themselves, to locate the fault in the timing, the market, the support they did or didn't get, then the habit has taken root. This doesn't mean external factors don't exist or that they don't matter. They absolutely exist, and they absolutely matter. But someone who consistently leads with external explanations has basically handed control of their results over to those external factors. They've made their outcomes depend on things they can't change instead of things they can. The willingness to ask what needs to change and to aim that question honestly at yourself is what takes that control back. It doesn't mean you ignore outside circumstances. It means that after you acknowledge them, you ask yourself what you're going to do differently within them. Because that's always available. Circumstances can be difficult, unfair, poorly timed, and genuinely tough. And within all of that, your choices, your habits, your thinking, and your daily effort still belong to you. No set of circumstances takes that away completely. It can get complicated by conditions, but it can't be removed. Now, there's also a quieter form of explanation worth looking at, because it's harder to spot and sticks around longer. It's the kind that's never said out loud, the kind that lives in the assumptions you carry about what's possible for you. When someone consistently sets small targets, or bails on efforts before they've had time to produce anything, or quietly assumes their situation is more locked in than it actually is, those are forms of explanation too, even though they don't sound like excuses. They're the background reasoning that determines what you try, how long you stick with it, and how seriously you take your own ability to get different results. Cleaning up that background reasoning is often harder than dealing with the spoken stuff, because it means examining beliefs you haven't fully admitted you hold. The moment someone stops negotiating with their outcomes and starts adjusting their approach, something practical and immediate changes. The energy that was going into building and maintaining explanations becomes available for something actually useful. The mental effort it takes to justify a result is no longer necessary, because the result is just being treated as information. Information about what the current approach is and isn't producing. That's all a result ever really is. It's data about how well the approach behind it is working. Looked at that way, a bad result isn't something embarrassing that needs an explanation. It's a signal that needs a response. Building this kind of relationship with your results takes practice, because most people have spent years in a different one. The instinct to protect yourself from the sting of a bad outcome by finding somewhere else to put the blame is deeply wired and completely human. Changing that doesn't happen in one moment of resolve. It happens through the repeated choice to respond to results with adjustment instead of accounting. Every time you look at what happened and ask what you'll do differently, instead of why things went the way they did, you're building a habit of correction that'll serve you for the rest of your life. This is at its core what it means to take full responsibility for your results. Not as a philosophy, not as something you declare when you're feeling motivated, but as a daily practical way of dealing with outcomes. The person who's genuinely adopted this approach isn't harder on themselves than anyone else. They're just more useful to themselves because they're spending their energy on what can be changed instead of on what already happened. They're pointing themselves forward, and in doing so, they're no longer at the mercy of explanations that have already proven they can't produce a different result. Most people spend the majority of their lives operating in the territory of preference. They prefer to be healthier, prefer to be more disciplined, prefer to earn more and build more and become more. The preference is genuine. It's not fake, and it's not something to dismiss. Someone who prefers improvement over stagnation is at least pointed in a useful direction. But preference by itself is one of the weakest forces available when it comes to producing actual change. It's not strong enough to carry you through difficulty. It's not strong enough to keep the effort going when things get uncomfortable. It's not strong enough to produce consistent action when you're not in the mood. Preference says, I would like this, and that's where it stops, because preference has no obligation attached to it. The world is full of people who would like to be different than they currently are. They'd like to read more, save more, work with greater focus, and follow through with greater consistency. They fully intend to do these things, and the intention is real. But intention rooted in preference rather than requirement tends to follow a pattern. It shows up strong at the beginning, when the idea is fresh and the energy is there, and the obstacles haven't fully shown themselves yet. Then, when the first real resistance hits, when it's inconvenient, when it's harder than expected, when there's something easier available, the preference steps aside. It doesn't vanish completely, It just waits, and then shows up again later as another intention, another fresh start, another genuine desire to do things differently this time. This cycle is familiar to most people because most people have lived it. Starting with enthusiasm and losing steam, once the initial energy fades, isn't a character flaw, and it's not unique to any particular type of person. It's just what happens when the driving force behind an effort is preference instead of requirement. Preference is conditional. It works when conditions support it. When conditions shift, when it's late, when it's cold, when other demands are competing for your attention, preference doesn't hold its ground. It bends. And bending, repeated often enough, becomes the habit that keeps any real lasting change from taking hold. Requirement operates on completely different terms. When something has moved from the category of preference into the category of requirement, whether conditions are favorable barely matters anymore. Someone who requires themselves to do something doesn't wait for the right mood. They don't check the day and decide whether circumstances line up. They act because the action has been placed outside the reach of negotiation. The difference between a preference and a requirement is, when you boil it down, the difference between something that's up for discussion and something that's not. And it turns out that this one distinction, simple as it sounds, shapes a person's long-term outcomes more than almost anything else. Crossing that line from preference to requirement doesn't happen because you suddenly develop more willpower or discipline than you had before. It doesn't take a personality change or a dramatic spike in motivation. What it takes is a decision, a real weighty decision about what kind of life is acceptable and what kind isn't. When you decide that a certain level of health is no longer optional, or that a certain financial situation won't be tolerated anymore, or that a certain standard of work is the bare minimum you'll accept from yourself, that decision is what shifts the category. The thing that was a preference becomes a requirement, not because it changed, but because your relationship to it changed. Understanding what drives that shift matters, because it doesn't come from the outside. Nobody can move something from your preference column into your requirement column for you. A teacher can't do it, a coach can't do it, someone who loves you can't do it. Others can influence, encourage, and create conditions that make the shift more likely. But the shift itself is always internal and always personal. It comes from honest reckoning, from looking at where you are and deciding that certain things about that picture are no longer acceptable. It's the moment where what you want for yourself finally outweighs what you're currently willing to settle for, and that outweighing produces a new standard. A new standard, once it's genuinely set, changes how you make decisions in ways that are immediate and practical. Before the standard existed, every decision involving effort or discipline was a fresh negotiation. Should I do this today, or is tomorrow good enough? Do I really need to follow through, or can I let it slide just this once? Is this effort level enough, or should I push harder? Those negotiations eat up an enormous amount of energy, and they rarely produce consistent results, because the outcome depends heavily on how you feel at the moment the negotiation is happening. Feeling energetic and motivated, the negotiation goes well. Feeling tired or pressed or just not into it, it goes the other way. When something becomes a requirement, those negotiations mostly stop. The question is no longer whether to do it, but how to do it. And that's a fundamentally different kind of question. It's more efficient, more directed, and way less draining. Someone who's genuinely decided that daily discipline in a particular area is a requirement doesn't burn mental energy every morning deciding whether today is the day they'll follow through. They follow through because the decision was already made, and made permanently, not temporarily. The energy that would have gone into the negotiation goes into the execution instead. And the results over time reflect that difference in a way that becomes impossible to miss. The evidence of this shift doesn't show up in grand gestures. It shows up in small, daily choices made consistently over time. It shows up in whether you do the necessary work on the days you don't feel like it, which is where the real separation happens. Anybody can perform well when energy is high and conditions are good. The days that reveal the difference between preference and requirement are the hard ones, the inconvenient ones, the ones where the easiest thing would be to let it go and try again tomorrow. On those days, someone running on preference will most often let it go. Someone running on requirement will most often not, because letting it go would mean violating a standard they've set for themselves, and they're no longer willing to do that. There's a relationship between self-respect and the standards you hold yourself to that's worth looking at closely. When you repeatedly fail to follow through on your own intentions, when preference keeps stepping aside the moment things get inconvenient, something happens over time to your sense of your own reliability. You start, on some level, to stop trusting your own commitments, because those commitments have a track record of not holding. That erosion is subtle, but it has real consequences. It affects the confidence you bring to future goals, because you're carrying the accumulated memory of past intentions that didn't survive contact with real conditions. You might keep setting goals and making plans, but underneath the planning, there's often a quiet doubt about whether this time will actually be different. Raising the standard, genuinely raising it, not as a declaration, but as a practiced daily reality, rebuilds that trust over time. Each time you do what you said you'd do, on a day when it wasn't easy, the foundation of self-trust gets a little more solid. As that foundation strengthens, the quality of future commitments improves, because they're being made by someone who has recent and consistent evidence that their word to themselves actually means something. This is one of the more valuable things you can build, not because it sounds impressive, but because it compounds. The person who consistently keeps their own standard becomes progressively more capable of the kind of disciplined effort that produces real, lasting results. The line between interest and requirement is, when it comes down to it, a line between the life you imagine and the life you build. Imagination and interest are wonderful things, and they're where most good efforts start. But they're the beginning, not the destination. The destination requires something more durable than interest. It requires caring enough about the outcome, caring enough about who you're becoming and what you're producing, to take the negotiation out of the equation entirely. The day that happens doesn't announce itself loudly. It's just the day you wake up and find that certain things are no longer optional. And from that day forward, the way you move through your life reflects that new and firmer reality. Every person, whether they've thought about it consciously or not, operates within a set of personal standards that defines the range of what they're willing to accept from themselves. That range controls way more than most people realize. It controls how you work when nobody's watching. It controls how you respond when you fall short of what you intended. It controls what you let pass without comment and what you deal with right away. It controls the quality of thinking you bring